Hello, I'm Louise Elizabeth Robertson and I'm going to read to you the start of Chapter 2 of Will and the Woadies, my story for you to listen to on YouTube. So here we go, Chapter 2, Home to Scotland, The Journey. After the 6-hour flight from the USA, Will and her parents were in the rental car. Will was sitting in the middle of the back seat on her way to Perth. She was wide awake and not at all happy about the prospect of staying at Aunt May's. It was not a problem with Aunt May or even her house. It was that Will felt anxious. Sometimes having a feeling like this can make a person behave in a way that they would not normally. Never before had she had to deal with this kind of situation. She was very uncomfortable about it. You might think that it was a bit odd, but truly Will had not even had an overnight stay on a school trip or been to a summer camp. It had just not worked out that way. The idea of her parents going somewhere without her was not sitting well, and there was not really any chance of turning back now. Nevertheless, she was not going to give up. Will piped up from the back of the car. "What about staying with Grandad Frank and Granny Betty?" "No, they're on a fishing trip on Loch Ness, and then they're off hiking the Highland Peaks," replied Mum. Will continued to rack her brains for another idea. "OK then, how about Grandpa George and Granny Chris? I'm sure they're not too busy." "I'm afraid not," said Mum. "Granny Chris is on a yoga retreat, and Grandpa George is rugby coaching, or something like that." Will was getting really desperate, so decided to mention her other grandparents. She had quite a lot of them, as her grandparents had divorced and remarried, and she had given up understanding who was a genetic grandparent and who was a step-grandparent. Instead, Will had decided that they were all real grandparents, and that was the easiest, so all of them had some sort of grandparent title. Will gave a heavy sigh and desperately suggested Granny Angela. This was a long shot, as Granny Angela was always off doing something crazy in some other part of the world. Of course, it was bad news, and no, it was not possible either, as Granny Angela was busy on a solo flight around the world. "And don't even mention Nanny Carol and Grandad Gavin," was the retort from Mum, as they too were on an adventure circumnavigating the world in a yacht. Grandad Gavin had been in the Royal Navy, you know. So there it was. Will had the double amount of grandparents that most children had, but none of them could look after her, as they were far too busy enjoying their retirement. "Why can't I have normal grandparents like other children?" she thought. "Ones that sit there and watch TV sport on Saturday afternoon and TV game shows every evening." Some children don't know when they are fortunate, especially when they have not experienced hardship themselves. And at this point, Will was behaving like a very spoilt and overindulged child. What's more, just like a spoilt and overindulged child, Will would not let go. "I'm never going to survive 6 whole weeks with Aunt May. It's going to be so boring," cried Will. "You will survive, and stop it now, Wilhelmina. It is what it is, and we'll have no more debate," said her parents in unison. They were now getting agitated by this unbecoming behaviour from Will, and Will knew that it was time to stop, as both her parents had used her full name in a very firm, "don't argue with me" tone of voice. So she sat in the back seat and looked out of the window and saw that now they were right out of Edinburgh Airport and well on their way to Perth. "We're coming to the bridge," shouted Dad. Will could see the magnificent structures of the 3 bridges crossing the Firth of Forth. They had to cross on the original road bridge, as although the new construction spanned the waters, it was not open yet. You would think that crossing a bridge was just that, crossing a bridge, but not in this case. If you ever get the chance to visit the bridges crossing the Firth of Forth yourself, you will realise. There was so much to see. It took 5 whole minutes to cross the bridge, and there was a feast of sights to take in during that time. First, there were 3 amazing feats of engineering that were the bridges themselves. The road bridge was a suspension bridge. The uprights seemed to go onwards and upwards into the clouds. It was all connected together with thick steel cables that seemed snake-like, holding it all together. Will imagined herself running up the slopes of the large steel tubes that carried the cables, and upon reaching the top, she would be able to survey the landscape, looking out to the sea on one side and into the Scottish hills on the other. Then off to her right was the railway bridge. It looked like one of those creations you weave together with art straws, but giant red art straws. "There's a train! There's a train!" cried Will with excitement. Will was beginning to enjoy the journey. "Wow, look at the villages underneath the railway bridges." Mum told her that they were the Queen's Ferry villages, where once a ferryman had ferried people across the Firth of Forth before the bridges were built. Mum also told Will a very interesting fact. "Do you remember the book Treasure Island, Will? Well, the author, Robert Louis Stevenson, stayed in the inn down there in South Queenferry, and that was where he started to write the story Kidnapped. You can even sit in the window in the inn where he sat and wrote." "That's so cool, Mum," said Will. On the other side of the road bridge was the construction of the 3rd bridge that crossed the Firth of Forth. Will wondered how on earth the engineers had managed to get the bridge to stand in the water. The water below was quite choppy, and she could see the white horses of the bubbling water very clearly. She made a note to herself that she would find out more about this later. It had been a long time since Will had been to Scotland. She had forgotten how beautiful the countryside was. Even though she was travelling on the motorway, the view was great. Usually motorways just carve their way through the countryside and you don't get to see the landscape. This motorway was very different to the 6-lane motorways Will had been used to in the USA. This was only 2 lanes on each side, and it was not just a long straight road. It cut its way through the countryside, passing the lochs and the green and purple hills of the Scottish countryside. Will felt really good inside as she looked at the land around her. It was a warm feeling, but one that made her want to cry too. She could not put her finger on this mix of emotions. She felt like she knew this land, and that this land was hers, and that she had come home. Well, I hope you enjoyed the start of chapter 2 and will join me for the rest of the chapters and the rest of this chapter at www.TalesILove.com, and I look forward to seeing you again. Goodbye, have a great day.